Hello and welcome to this week's episode of About Abortion. I'm joined again by Tim Lewis. Tim, how are you doing today?
I'm good, Dave. Yeah, good. Thanks. People are watching. They'll be pleased to know I finally had a haircut, but not a shave. You can't have it all.
Oh,
But there
I
we
was
go.
just about to say, I thought you had that longed for haircut. Just the other day, one of my children said, Dad, you need a haircut. And I couldn't disagree. But it's just one of those things I find sometimes it takes a year to get around to that sort of thing. But
Oh,
what can you
absolutely.
do? What can you do? So, Tim, today we are carrying on with our little mini series, aren't we, in common objections. So, for those who haven't heard um, the previous two episodes we've done on this, can you just quickly just outline for us again what's the idea behind this? Where's it come from, and what's it for?
Sure. Yeah. No, I thought you were going to ask me to do what have we done so far, and as my brain was suddenly whirring as to what have we done. But no. So I can remember. So really, this is a series designed. I mean, I guess designed for all church folks, but I guess particularly with church leaders, pastors, ministers in mind. In terms of And these are all real objections that we've come across sometimes many times in our work, in our ministry. One of the common objections that keep people from doing sustained or kind of in-depth direct preaching and teaching on this topic that we call abortion, on the kind of destruction of the unborn child. So these are things. So far we've done about, well, you know, people might say, well, I want to do this, but I'm worried it's going to upset or offend people. So we looked at that, I believe, in the first episode. We then looked at the objection that really this is primarily should be seen as a woman's issue, and so really as men, uh, as many church leaders are, they shouldn't have any kind of right to speak into that. And so that's the kind of thing we're doing really in this series. So we're hoping it's practical, it's helpful, and really it clears away some of that clutter, some of that um, stuff that stops people from getting to the point where they actually preach what the Bible says on this issue.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, funny enough, I was speaking with a pastor um, of a church I was speaking at quite recently, and he was listing off some of the objections that he had received, either from others in the leadership team or people in the church, and he was pretty much listing our sort of contents page for this series. So these are real issues, and actually there was one he mentioned that we haven't yet done, and that's what we're doing today, which is what if there are visitors here? So visitors in church, non Christians in church, maybe family, friends, inquirers, seekers, whatever we want to call them. There's a great concern that, okay, well, maybe there's a place to be talking about these issues in house, just amongst Christians, but we really don't want to be doing it if there are visitors here because it will put them off, it'll freak them out, it'll confirm all their worst nightmares about what we're really like, and we mustn't let them really know what we think about this issue. And I think for a certain kind of church, maybe not for all churches, but for a certain kind of church, this could well be the key issue. I think some churches see um, their kind of very reason for existence um, as numerical growth and reaching as many people as possible. And I think we're going to actually talk about that more in the next episode, aren't we? You know, what is the mission of the church? But certainly some churches see that as, well, if this doesn't help to grow the church, it doesn't belong. And actually, that's something I experienced very early on in this journey. On a personal note, one of the first churches I approached and was in discussion with about teaching on this issue, there was some pretty strong opposition from someone within the leadership team. He actually wrote an entire paper about why we shouldn't do this. But one of the key points he put in there was we can't see the missional value in this. By which he meant this isn't going to help evangelistically. It's not going to help with visitors. It's going to put them off. So that's the objection, and I think it is holding a lot of churches back. And I think it's worth saying I do, although I fundamentally disagree, as we'll come across further down the line here, with the conclusion, we can't allow this concern to censor the word of God. I do understand where it's coming from, and I can actually see myself in that some years back. I think I was very much of the opinion we shouldn't get too political. We shouldn't put what I would call stumbling blocks before people. We should just keep it really simple, let the gospel be the sole focus, and don't let people think they have to have this political affiliation or that particular view before they can start coming to church, before they can hear the gospel. And I think I really, for many years, thought that the way to do evangelism was to make sure you never offend anyone and you look just as normal as possible. In fact, looking back now, I could say as worldly as possible. But that there is a sincere motivation within that, wrapped up in that. Yes, there's a lot of bad stuff mixed in for sure. There's fear of man. There's it's very convenient if your evangelistic methodology happens to involve everyone liking you, but there is a sincere desire there, of course, to see people come to know Christ, and certainly we shouldn't be putting unnecessary hindrances in the way of that. So there is something in this objection that I think we can sort of recognise and acknowledge that there's something there which we at some level would agree with, but the conclusion that therefore we shouldn't talk about certain things. Tim, what do you think about that? The conclusion that is kind of drawn there.
Yeah, and I think this. Just picking up what you said at the start, I think this is a very common one, and I shared on one of I think probably the first of this series that this was a concern that a pastor had, whose church I was going to speak in, and particularly on the Sunday morning, and it got rearranged for that reason. I mean, for me, there may occasionally be, but I think you're right, Dave. I think there is a genuine concern that people will be put off for the wrong reasons. I think there's also perhaps a concern lurking behind some of these fears, and I don't think we should be naive to this either, that there is a broader worry regarding any negative publicity whatsoever. Because I think for some churches, yes, it's about numerical growth, but it's also about being talked well of, spoken well of in the
Mm,
community, and people having a very positive image of the church in the community. And again, what one would not say that's wrong in itself, but if that becomes the determining factor, if that becomes the metric for all your ministry, I think we've got a problem, which will
mm,
kind of unwrap as we go. But there's almost this thing about, well, what if the local press got wind of this? What would the local rag make of a
mm,
sermon on abortion? To say nothing of
mm,
the likes of the Guardian. But arguably for me, the question behind the question, so this worry about visitors is really, I think, a more fundamental one of what is the church actually for? Okay, what is the church actually for? What is the purpose of God's people universally, and what is the purpose of individual local congregations as outposts of that greater mission? Is it to be peddlers of some sort of seeker sensitive kind of therapeutic deism, which I do worry lies behind a bit of these concerns? Or is the purpose of the church that it's committed to proclaiming the truth and growing the kingdom, come what may? And, Jesus says the gates of hell will not prevail. So we're not to worry too much about the resistance. Um, but I think in terms of whether this is a well-founded concern or not vis-a-vis visitors, I want to dive into some scripture really, and I think there's a plethora of texts we could go to. Um, I'm going to limit myself to John 6 on this occasion, but Dave, feel free to chip in as we go. So John 6, which is a very long chapter of the gospel, kind of lengthy dialogue, where Jesus is um, revealing really that he's the bread of life. He's the necessary spiritual food, in other words, for all those who want to live eternally. So it's an important message for people to get their heads around. Let me read just a few verses, literally 2 or 3 verses from 41. So the Jews, which I think really means the kind of Jewish leadership or the religious leaders on this occasion, the Jews grumbled about him because he said, "I am the bread that came down from heaven." They said, "Is not this Jesus, the son of Joseph, whose father and mother we know? How does he now say, 'I have come down from heaven'?" Jesus answered them, do not grumble among yourselves. No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him, and I will raise him up on the last day. So that's John 6:41 to 44. So 4 verses, in fact. What I want to pull out here primarily, though, is that this difficult teaching, and this is a teaching that is commented several times that it's difficult, not just for
Mm.
the crowds but for the disciples. This difficult teaching is given not only to the inner circle, so we might think of the kind of 12 disciples, or even a wider grouping of the committed, maybe akin to a kind of usual congregation size, but it's essentially public teaching, as so much actually of Jesus' teaching is. So verse 24 speaks simply of the crowd. It's the any old person might be there. Verse 59 then expands to mention a synagogue in Capernaum, but again, I think we're to understand a pretty diverse group that's gathered, including obviously representatives of the Jewish leadership. So people that may not necessarily side with Jesus, outsiders, if you like. Um, so if ever there was an occasion to maybe tread carefully or to kind of appeal to the broadest possible cross section, this would probably be it. But Jesus doesn't really do that. He doesn't seem to mind. He even risks confusion and
Mm.
scandal as he teaches the people. Confusion really that this local boy, whose parents everybody knows, we know where you live, we know where you grew up, could really be anything more than a carpenter and jobbing preacher. But scandal actually also in that he then invites this motley crew to partake of his flesh and blood and live forever. Seriously, Jesus? If the disciples were frequently confused by Jesus' teaching, not least regarding bread and yeast, you think of all those the confusion that it's caused them on that one subject, they certainly would have found this a stretch, eating Jesus' flesh, his flesh being true blood, bread, etc., etc. And it does indeed put some folks off. So going towards the end of the passage, verse 60, when many of his disciples heard it, they said, "This is a hard saying. This is a hard saying. Who can listen to it? We're off. We're off to the church down the road, thanks." And a little later, we're told, after this, many of his disciples turned back and no longer walked with him. So, you know, from an outward perspective or from simply a worldly perspective looking in, this is a bit of a disaster. This is a kind of PR disaster, if you like. Certainly in terms of numerical growth, which again, I don't want to say is unimportant, but it doesn't seem to be the key thing that is driving Jesus's ministry at this point. And I would argue that numerical growth is not the church's raison d'etre either. Faithfulness to God is.
Mm.
And Jesus places a number of things above simple numbers.
Mm.
Certainly, he doesn't use popularity or public consensus to drive him or his ministry or the subjects to which he addresses himself. Jesus refuses to do miracles on demand. He refuses to be made king, by popular demand of the people, to kind of satisfy this idea of this popular folk belief of what the Messiah should look like and what the Messiah actually should be doing, which was basically kind of giving the Romans a good pasting. So, and that's one scripture among many which we could look at, but I think we see Jesus interacting with a crowd that would have included what we might say people
Mm.
parallel to visitors. And he doesn't sort of particularly tailor his message, I would argue. He kind of teaches what he does throughout the gospel, which is God's truth. He's been given this mission from above. He actually says this is his food, to do the will of God. This is part of doing God's will, speaking the truth of God, but in a way that frequently actually causes some confusion, some division, and also a loss of numbers. And as I
Mm.
was reflecting on this passage, because one of the other things, Dave, that we want to do in this series, as we're addressing primarily the issue of abortion, we want to see how other contemporary issues or other factors in the church sort of parallel this issue. And in other words, why is it that we may feel quite positive about addressing other issues, but from this issue of abortion particularly, we kind of stay away? And so that's included a number of things. So when we were talking about causing offence, we touched upon sexuality and gender and the whole debate around that within the world, recognizing that although this was controversial, most faithful churches would not let that sort of put them off or dictate terms for addressing this stuff biblically. When we came to talk about the objection that men particularly shouldn't be allowed to speak on abortion, we touched on race and racism. So there are a couple of the things we've looked at. The issue I want to bring in here is a little bit different, but I hope it will make sense, particularly on the basis of the passage. And that's the issue of communion. So when we look at John 6 about eating Jesus' flesh, drinking his blood, which is a kind of extended metaphor, as we've said, about sustenance and life being found uniquely in Jesus Christ. Quite understandably, though, it comes to be seen as having kind of Eucharistic overtones. So there's a link here to communion or the Lord's Supper, however people kind of tend to describe that act in their own churches. Now, John, of course, does not have an account of the Last Supper as the other synoptic gospels do, hence the appropriateness of finding this theme in John 6. And of course, Jesus tells us that we are regularly to come together to share bread and wine. And some churches would do this every time they come together. I'm not sort of saying what's right or wrong here, but I'm just saying it's obviously a key part of Christian worship. It's a spiritually significant event, and Jesus tells us to keep doing it until he comes again, essentially. And Paul considers it so important that he gives extensive teaching on it in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Yet I think we have to realize that to the outsider, it's pretty weird. Communion is pretty weird. Even to the extent that sometimes when you're in a church that doesn't have it every week, when we have it at our church, and sometimes our boys in the service, they're kind of looking a bit quizzically, going, "What's happening here? Is this snack? Whatever? What's going on?" So, I think communion does look a bit weird to the outsider, to the visitor. And in the early church, critics of the early church even, slandered the Christian community by saying this is, they're practicing all sorts of weird stuff. Cannibalism's going on. They're eating flesh and drinking blood. And you can see how there's a sort of parody of the language that's used. Now, that's easily refuted. But the broader point is that the Lord's Supper may indeed appear strange, even exclusive, actually, to visitors. So on the strict definition of a kind of seeker-sensitive approach to worship, we should probably ditch it. Now, that's obviously not what I'm recommending, but I struggle to see how communion isn't up there alongside a difficult teaching topic. If our key metric is for faithfulness, it revolves around visitor experience, if I can use a kind of controversial term there, but one hears the kind of consumeristic echoes in that phrase, visitor experience. It might be something you hear Joel Osteen talking about. It's probably not something you hear Jesus talking about too much. But if that's the key metric, then you can see how well probably we want to get rid of communion, because that's just a bit weird, and actually it's a bit exclusive. So that's my parallel issue, I think, on this particular topic, because I think it illustrates how Christian worship, Christian preaching, Christian teaching involves things that are not necessarily tailored to the needs of visitors, but are nonetheless, I think, powerful and also helpful, not just to those within the church, not just to the in-group, but to those who may be encountering Christian worldview for the first time. So that was a pretty long-winded response to your question, Dave. But I think, I think just to ditch something, so a teaching topic, in this case, abortion, because visitors may be there, I struggle with that, because I think you're tying your hands on virtually everything, and you're sort of
Yeah.
saying, well, we're allowing non-Christians, unbelievers, to dictate our kind of program, to dictate what we teach on, what we preach on, to dictate how we should be as church. I mean, that can't be right, can it?
Yeah, I think it's helpful the example you brought out there, the early church being accused of cannibalism. Jesus said we're blessed when people falsely say all kinds of evil about us. That's right there in the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes. We're blessed when they say false things about us. Now, I think there's something uniquely painful about a false allegation. It's quite right at some level to feel indignant about a false allegation. It's very unpleasant, and I think there are a lot of people out there who who perhaps don't mind being disagreed with or even hated, so long as they're understood. So long as you're not putting words in my mouth and making stuff up about me. But Jesus says, "Blessed are you when people falsely say all kinds of evil about you because of me." And so actually, our assessment of Christians being accused of cannibalism because they're observing what the Lord told them to observe is they're blessed. Now, if it's true that we're blessed when people falsely say all kinds of evil about us, how much more would it be true that we're blessed when they say accurately things about us that they don't like? Being known for what we actually are for and hated, well, surely that's a blessing. Surely that is encompassed in this, because Um, we know that on the one hand, Christ and therefore his followers are the aroma of life to some, but the stench of death to others. So people will respond differently to Christ, to the gospel, to Christians. Um, not only through misunderstanding that, although of course that happens, but it's not only through misunderstanding. They can understand, they can see, they can know exactly what it is they're rejecting or hating. For example, standing up for the sanctity of human life. And actually, we should consider ourselves. I mean, again, it's there in the Sermon on the Mount. We should rejoice and be glad when people persecute or hate us for righteousness' sake. So we should really welcome this and be quite grateful if we find that we're being hated, um, because that's what we're told as part of the deal. And great is our reward in heaven. And I think it's interesting how reputation is one of those things that I think we've absorbed from the world and rebranded with a bit of Christian jargon. We take a few phrases or words out of context, like beyond reproach, or good repute, and so on. And actually, I think we develop those so much into a concept that goes way beyond what is written. So we actually end up saying, well, anything that outsiders don't like, well, that must be bad for the reputation of the gospel and of the church. And I've had that issue, is people say this is not going to be good for the reputation of the church. And it's a bit like stewardship. Sometimes we justify greed or accumulating wealth. We call it good stewardship and so on. I think reputation is one of those things, and certainly during the pandemic times, I remember speaking with pastors and others, and to me, what seemed to take way too much precedence was, well, what will the neighbours think? We mustn't bring the gospel into disrepute. Now, of course, that is a consideration. We are to live at peace with people as far as it's possible, and so on. But really, if we let outsiders write the program, who's Lord of the Church? Who's this actually for? And so I think we need to reconcile ourselves to bad repute. To, as you said from John chapter 6, some disciples, in fact many disciples, turned back at that point. And of course, that's not something we rejoice in. It's not something we want, but we do need to be reconciled to it, because that's just how it goes with faithful gospel preaching. Some turn back. Now, is it our desire, along with God's, that all should be saved? Absolutely. But we can't start twisting or censoring the message to, well, if we're honest, we're not preventing people from going away. We're just deceiving ourselves and procrastinating and sort of delaying the inevitable, which is actually, if they're not here for the truth, if they're not actually convicted by the Holy Spirit, if they don't love Jesus for who he actually is, then actually, what are they here for? Because they're not here for what they should be here for. So we're kind of just putting off the inevitable if we try and hide that. But it was interesting, the point you made there about how it's not, if we're honest, it's not just about people becoming Christians. We're not just scared of putting off outsiders who might be coming in, but actually we just don't like to offend the dignitaries, the powers that be, the local press or whatever. And I was reminded actually of a story I heard not too long ago, about, and this is actually at Wycliffe Hall some years back. So Wycliffe, for those who don't know, would certainly describe itself as an evangelical college in Oxford, Bible training college for the Church of England, evangelical training college. And there was someone, not me, there was someone I know who preached in that chapel on abortion. And he actually got taken aside afterwards and reprimanded. And the reason given was, what if the vice president was listening in on that sermon, or the whatever it is, the vice chancellor of the university. What if the vice chancellor, because the thing was being live streamed as well, what if they heard what we were talking about? What would happen then? So if we're honest, I don't think it's because they thought, the vice chancellor's on the cusp of becoming a Christian, and this could have just, I think the reality is it was we don't want that, we don't want a fly in the ointment here. And again, that's just not something that Jesus really seemed to worried about.
And unfortunately, nothing about that story surprises me. But I think how interesting on a number of levels. So on one level, I mean, I'm sure there's a whole number of issues that might have been broached in chapel that would have been out of sync with, you know, the university vice chancellor's position on things. Let's be clear, universities are at the vanguard of cultural Marxism. If you're taking your moral, ethical bearings from a university, then God help you, because they're lost. Um,
Mm,
but yeah, why? There's something again about why that one particular issue, and I know I'm fascinated by the fact that among universities, more pro-life societies are kicked out of student unions than even Christian unions are. So there seems to be something
mm,
particular. This is a particular idol that our culture is precious about and jealous of. But yeah, what a fascinating insight, and I think just a depressing insight into how the world often sets the agenda. And I think that whole thing, Dave, of institutional reputation. I mean, that is 100% a worldly
mm, mm,
product and concept, as far as I can see.
mm,
Where does one see that in the Gospels? Where does one see that in the Book of Acts? It's not there. Um, I
mm,
yeah, I mean, I just
mm,
it's desperate, isn't it? But I think
mm.
we need to expose that for what it is, 100%.
There was another thing, Tim, I thought
I mean,
worth
I
picking up
sorry,
on,
go on.
which
Yeah,
is
go on.
oh, sorry, I think there's a delay here. The other thing I thought was worth picking up on in what you shared was just how Jesus said what he said in John chapter 6, not just to the inner circle, but everyone was listening, the dignitaries and everyone else, the powers that be. I think that's quite interesting because I think something that's quite beautiful. One of the many things that I find beautiful about Jesus' character is just his integrity. He didn't hide things. He didn't. He didn't sort of pretend to be one thing in one context
Yeah.
and have a sort of political strategy for getting people on board before they knew what he was really about. Such that he could say, "Look, I was teaching in the temple courts every day. You didn't arrest me. You know, none of this has been done in secret." And I think there's something compelling about that. It's honest, it's sincere, um, and yet going back to the anecdote I shared at the beginning, this church said we can't see the missional value in this. One of the things that that particular leader tried to do is he tried to say, well, maybe let's just teach about this, on a Tuesday evening for those who want to learn more. And of course, there are many problems with that. One is hardly anyone comes, especially if they know what the topic's going to be about. But the other is what's the whole attempt there? The attempt is to conceal and hide from the world out there what we actually think, such that if they ever do become one of us, one day eventually they'll find out what we really stand for, and then what? Will they feel misled? Will they feel they've been lied to? And some people call this honeypot evangelism, where you sort of bring people in on one premise, and then you turn it around and it's not what they came for. They didn't know that's what this is all about. And so there's a kind of, frankly, a dishonesty there. Um, and and it's really unchristian. Paul says, we commend ourselves to every man's conscience. We speak plainly. We don't use fancy words. It's plain to everyone who we are, what we're about. And that is the Christian way to go about things.
Yeah, absolutely. There's something key about integrity, isn't there? And I think it's in a way, integrity is a value our culture prizes, but I think it's a value our culture very rarely gets right. And I think it's a challenge for the church. And I actually think it's even what I think is even more interesting, Dave, is that when actually we see Jesus's kind of evangelistic method strategy, for one, to use that kind of language for a second, Jesus is not constricted by these concerns. I don't think in the way that we are. Our friend Pete Jackson, who himself is a pastor, talks about um, culturally relevant evangelism and teaching that really kind of doesn't shy away from the idols of our day, doesn't shy away from the issues of our day. And actually, I think biblical teaching that worth its salt is it's constantly on the lookout, actually not hiding and dodging things, but looking, well,
Mm,
how does this speak into our culture, how does this speak to this particular idol? And let me just bring out a couple of examples. in terms of the Gospels, where Jesus interacts with the rich young ruler and the woman at the well, and those are interesting because on the one hand, the first case it doesn't really go well, and that the rich young ruler ultimately it is too much for him, and he goes away very sad, and we don't know if his story ends there, but it again, it's not a particular success for Jesus' evangelistic strategy, which is interesting because most of the time Jesus is teaching and preaching are at least initially very effective. And then the woman at the well. So this is John 4, of course, the Samaritan woman. So not an Orthodox Jew. So that's interesting. So she would probably tick the visitor box in a way that the rich young ruler wouldn't actually. Um, it leads very positively to her coming to faith, and actually a huge number of her fellow sort of Samaritan villagers, and they come to recognize Jesus as the savior of the world. It's one of the great early Christological confessions of John's gospel. So let's look at these in a little bit detail, because the rich young ruler, if he was to kind of wander into our church today, and sit there on the front row, and you know we could imagine maybe a Premier League footballer, something like that, someone a young guy with the world at his feet. Although actually that's not quite the case, because this is a guy who's tried to keep the law, isn't it? But the one issue we probably think to ourselves, well, let's not go there because it's pretty obvious, is his wealth, his finances. This guy's got a lot in the bank. He's got umpteen cars. He's got umpteen houses. And you can imagine the contemporary kind of evangelical response here. Let's not rock the boat. Yes, let's talk about sin. Let's talk about our need, but let's keep it pretty generic. Let's certainly not talk anything that's going to be embarrassing in terms of money and the like. Let's not mention money. And just imagine if he gets saved, what his tithe would be. Let's be honest; those things swirl around churches, and the treasurer might be thinking that. I'm pretty sure that's what Judas was thinking actually regarding the rich young ruler. Just think how much this guy's going to bring into the collective purse if he gets on board. But money is actually what Jesus makes a beeline for. So rather than it being the one thing that he kind of skirts around, doesn't get, he makes a beeline for it. His possessions. He says, I can see that you're serious, but look, all this is going to be a bit of a sideshow until you tackle this one issue in your life that is keeping you from wholehearted discipleship, that is keeping you from knowing God's purpose for yourself. And that's very similar to the woman at the well. Contemporary wisdom here would be to go big on grace, and one might just consider for a moment how many evangelical churches are called Grace Church. To go big on grace, to emphasize, well, we're all sinners, we're all in this together. We all need God's compassion and God's grace. And of course, that's true. Of course, we're all sinners. Of course, we're all in dire need of God's grace. And Jesus does talk about the need for living water, for true refreshment, which of course is a shared need for us all. But look what else Jesus talks about. Her 5 husbands and counting. And here you go, well, that's not such a generic experience, Jesus. That's maybe a little bit of a sore point. That's quite personal. That's quite pointed. Not so subtle, we might think. Yet arguably, this is exactly what opens the woman up to this genuine spiritual encounter. And it's fascinating that from that point on, the woman's next question really broaches some deep theology. She's talking about land, she's talking about worship, she's talking about the patriarchs of the Old Testament story, she's talking about the role of the place of Jerusalem. She's talking actually about how to approach the living God. How does one actually have a relationship with God? Now, would she have got there if that elephant in the room had not been addressed? Well, very possibly. This is Jesus after all who's talking to her. But Jesus doesn't, he doesn't avoid that ongoing issue of her sexual immorality. And again, I ask the question, how many preachers would have dived in there like Jesus did with that issue? So when we think about Jesus' evangelism, which is both deeply effective, it's also deeply relevant to the individuals
Mm.
he addresses. And again, I would say we see that very much continue into Acts. Paul and the other apostles, what they do is they often combine very skillfully cultural apologetics with evangelism. They challenge the false idols of their day with the message of the
Mm.
true living God and his son, Jesus Christ. Um, you know, Jesus Jesus doesn't focus on them getting right with God first, and then they can work on their issues, their greed, their serial adultery, whatever it may be. No, he tackles the issues head on as a way actually to bring them to God and into right relationship with the Lord.
Yeah.
Um, and you know, Dave, when we think about this issue of abortion, actually, for those who've been involved in the sort of street display work in interaction with the public, and it, you know, can't get much more public than being out on the streets, time and again, don't we? We see how that issue of abortion opens people up. Those who are actually
Yep.
serious about the conversation and don't just want to kind of shout abuse, opens people up to serious conversations about life, about death, about right and wrong, about the nature of humanity, about playing God, about consequences, about judgment. Yes, there's apologetics there, but it's also a natural stepping stone into evangelistic conversations. So I would
Mm.
say, you know, there's far more possibility. We're shutting far more doors than we're opening, actually. We think we're kind of keeping things safe and stuff, but actually we are shutting a door and we're not taking those God given opportunities like Paul and the other apostles
Mm.
when we close this as even a possibility to touch on where there might be visitors
Mm.
present.
Yeah, 100%. I think that little phrase you said, this idea that we help people to get right with God first, and then we'll go on and deal with those other things. I think that sort of reveals, and you know, we could say that's a parody, but actually that is how a lot of us think, and actually that is a slightly distorted view of the gospel. The idea that you can get right with God and you've still got your idols safely in your back pocket, and we'll deal with those at another point. It suggests that getting right with God is purely a doctrinal thing, whereas, of course, as Jesus said, you know, even the demons believe that. So this idea that doctrinal assent is really the only critical thing. We don't really need to address someone's idols now, or even maybe ever, because actually,
Yeah.
how many would say to the rich young ruler, even 5 years in or 10 years in to him having professed faith, you know, now you've got to leave all your money. I mean, we just don't go there. So I think there is we've got a misunderstanding about the gospel, the essence of the gospel. Whereas, as you say, Jesus made a beeline for the idols. It's because it's a thorny issue. It's because it's personal and painful and delicate. It's because it's so close to their sense of identity. That's precisely where the gospel needs to go. That's where we need the treatment of the gospel, because that's ultimately, when someone comes to Christ, it is a shift of allegiance, isn't it? It's turning away from worthless idols, out of the kingdom of darkness, into the kingdom of the Son. And Jesus must be Lord, not just as an idea, but as a reality. And so it's precisely because it's painful. So, you know, this objection, what if there are visitors here? I'm saying it's because there are visitors here. Fantastic. There are visitors here. This is a great opportunity. And I mean that genuinely. When I go to a church and I hear there might be visitors here, I thank the Lord and I pray especially for them. And I always open with a gospel address and I address the unbelievers in the room, whether they've had abortions or not. But something I have seen, as you mentioned it on the streets, we've seen it in the church as well. I've noticed people really lean in when you're talking about a real issue. I think people out there who are serious, who want to know the truth, they're sick of this sort of beige, watered down, uh, never offend anyone kind of messaging. They can get that anywhere. They're getting that all the time. But when they hear, and it doesn't mean, of course, we're not gracious and so on, but actually when they do hear a gracious, thoughtful, but bold and uncompromising treatment of an issue like abortion, which is all around us, actually that's one of the things that can, I think, and perhaps this is very counterintuitive for some, but I think it can actually adorn the gospel. It can show something of the beauty and the power of the gospel, because actually this gospel is big enough. Other people, you know, Islam might not have a good answer to abortion, but Christianity does. Jesus does. Jesus is big enough. The gospel is big enough. And so not only is it because it's an issue for people, it's also because the gospel is big enough. And we actually therefore can be emboldened to address it with confidence and see this as an opportunity. And with the help of the Holy Spirit, in the preaching or whatever the context is, but we're talking specifically here about preaching, we can really see this as an opportunity, not as a sort of, oh, I really hope no one comes this Sunday, but actually, And that, actually, I think we ought to say on that, assume there are visitors there. In any church, in your own church, of course. And I think a preacher should always have sort of some recognition of that. We don't exist for the outsiders. We don't let them dictate the message, but we should certainly be praying for people to visit and to hear the gospel. And I think whilst there are dangers with the sort of seeker sensitivity model, it does seem in 1 Corinthians 14, for example, it seems assumed that there might well be unbelievers present in the gathering. Maybe they're spouses, maybe they are neighbors, whatever. So we don't build it around them, but I think it should be with them in mind. They should be in our prayers. I think we should think about the sort of language we use if we are going to use technical theological terms or refer to kind of more obscure scriptures, whatever. I think we want to do that in ways that an outsider can hopefully keep up with. It's not about them changing the message, but it is wanting to make things successful in those senses. Absolutely, we shouldn't put barriers in front of people. But it's especially if there are visitors here, we should be excited about engaging this so that we can actually see, as you say, culturally relevant evangelism and not something that's sort of vague or even actually a betrayal of what the gospel is, a sort of an abstract intellect only with no conclusions. Jesus was very, very applied in his teaching of the gospel, as were the apostles in the letters.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think there's an occasion in Acts as well, isn't there, where Paul is preaching almost in a kind of lecture hall, lecture theatre. So there's a sense that people from the public, it's a pretty kind of permeable situation,
Mm,
and I think that's right. I think, as he says on another occasion, in Acts, these things weren't done in a corner. And I don't think as
mm,
Christians we should be hiding away in our corners in sort of holy
mm,
huddles.
mm,
Um, we're all right,
mm,
Jack. The world's going to hell in a handcart.
mm, mm.
To some extent, I mean, the church exists to glorify God, but it exists also to bear witness to a watching
Yeah,
world of the truth of the gospel, the truth of Jesus Christ. So
yeah,
yeah, 100%.
yeah. So I think on the one
And I
hand, we
think
want to say to
go
people,
on.
sorry, yeah, I think on the one hand, we do want to say to people, be reconciled, as in John 6, to the fact some people may be offended, they may drift away, they may turn back. The rich young ruler, Jesus didn't get that wrong. That wasn't a mistake on Jesus' part. He said the truth. The rich young ruler at that point in time couldn't handle it, and that was that. So we need to reconcile to that. But on the other hand, I also want to say, don't be surprised actually that when you preach about this, as we see on the streets, but also in churches, actually many are attracted and they are thankful, especially thankful. I've spoken with preachers recently who spoke on the issue of abortion, and they said people were listening more than ever. People really gave more feedback than ever. It's when you touch these issues that for believers and unbelievers, people really sit up and pay attention. So, on the one hand, reconcile to the fact that some will depart, but others will be drawn, and so as is often the case, I think our fears are really quite exaggerated. The idea that, oh, no one will ever become a Christian again or whatever if I speak about this. Actually, you'll probably be pleasantly surprised. The opposite is true. People say, wow, I've never really heard that before. That really made sense. That's the first time I've heard a logical treatment of that issue that actually makes sense. These are the sorts of comments um, we've heard. So there's an opportunity here, not just a cost, as it were, to be counted.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. Y- I mean, there's lots more I could say, but I think I want to just kind of limit myself actually to saying that I think in touching on this issue about what if the visitors here and actually opening up that issue of, well, what do we exist for anyway? What is the purpose of the church? Perhaps with some soul searching for that during COVID and stuff. I think we're coming to really, recognizing what it is that prevents a lot of people from going there. And I think I want to just at this point, Dave, give a little bit of a trail, a little bit of a teaser to the next episode in this series, which carries on this conversation away, because that's the idea of, well, the church only actually exists to preach the gospel. Okay, that is our sole raison d'etre, and as often we frequently heard, the ethics, sorry, will take care of itself. So actually, I think these two go together. So I want to
Mm,
encourage people to tune in next time when we kind of open up and exploit that myth that actually The church is just here to preach the gospel, and all these extra side issues, ethical side issues, are simply that. They're side issues. They're, if anything, they're a distraction. We need to keep
Mm,
the main thing, because that is again an objection that we hear frequently, including from sort of churches that would claim to take the Bible seriously, that would be
mm,
claim to take doctrine very seriously. So I just want to,
mm,
I think for myself, I think that's all I want to say on this particular topic, but I want to put it out there that because
mm.
they almost segue together, these two issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think hopefully what we've shown in this episode is, even if it is just about preaching the gospel, even if only for faithful preaching of the gospel, even if only for evangelistic reasons, do go there. But as we're going to say in our next episode, there's a lot more to be said about the mission of the church. I just want to close, if I may, with something from 1 Corinthians 14. I think, I sort of sketched out two different profiles there: the person who's offended and goes away, like the rich young ruler, and there's the person who's attracted. Um, but perhaps that's a bit too simplistic. Perhaps it's helpful to see that someone can be offended and therefore be attracted. And I think this is something that we need to, again, expect, pray for. This is kind of par for the course. I think C.S. Lewis, described himself as the world's most reluctant convert, didn't he? And I think any genuine conversion actually involves offence, and being humbled. In some cases is more dramatic than in others. But I think perhaps rather than just thinking purely in terms of someone will be offended and we'll never see them again, others will absolutely love it and they'll be drawn. Well, actually, there is an experience of, I'm offended, I'm convicted. Perhaps that's a better word. I'm convicted, and I'm drawn. And here's an interesting window into the whole question of seeker sensitivity within scriptures. This is 1 Corinthians chapter 14. Reading from verse 24, but if an unbeliever or someone who does not understand comes in while everybody is prophesying, he will be convinced by all that he is a sinner and will be judged by all. And the secrets of his heart will be laid bare. So he will fall down and worship God, exclaiming, God is really among you. And there's something perhaps a bit similar to the woman at the well here. Wow, the secrets of my heart are being read here. This is uncomfortable, but actually it's what leads someone to confessing Jesus as Lord. And I think when we think in terms of seeker sensitivity, think, oh, offense would be the worst outcome. Well, actually, conviction is essential. There's a sense in which we need people to be offended at some point. Was it Peter's listeners were cut to the heart? What shall we do? It's pretty painful to find out, you're a Jew, you've just been accused of nailing to a cross the promised Messiah. That is a difficult pill to swallow. They're cut to the heart. And actually, that's what we need. We need people cut to the heart. And so whether it's abortion or some other issue, there's an opportunity there for the Spirit of God to be working through the preaching of the word to bring that necessary offense or conviction, which will actually, in God's goodness, lead to repentance and faith. So rather than seeing this as something to be tiptoed around, let's see this as a great opportunity for the preaching of the gospel, and especially when there are visitors present.